How you doing?
What up, yo? Welcome back to Forever Backlog, the show where I review my gaming backlog as I go through it for your viewing pleasure. Question: how do we feel about remakes? Wait, no, not those kinds of remakes. That's right, today we are delving into XCOM Enemy Unknown, which, come to think of it, you might not have known was a remake. XCOM Enemy Unknown was released in 2012, developed by the fine people at Firaxis Games and distributed by 2K. It is a reimagining, or reboot, tomato, of the 1994 game UFO Enemy Unknown, or XCOM UFO Defense, depending on where you got it. Now, this wasn't some hidden gem, mind you. It's very much a cult classic and still ranked as one of the best PC games ever made by a lot of people, but, 1994. Unlike its predecessor, Enemy Unknown is a sci-fi themed turn-based tactics game. Because of this, I very much anticipated that this game would be right up my alley. Even though I've yet to play some of the classics, I consider myself a big fan of turn-based strategy games. That, plus the high praise it got pretty much across the board, had this game burning a pretty big hole in my backlog. So the game is set during an alien invasion of Earth in the near future. Or what would have been the near future at the time. You play the role of commander of a multinational paramilitary organization tasked with defending the planet from the invaders, called XCOM. You play out a series of skirmishes against the alien threat in a desperate hope to defend the planet and also try and figure out what it is exactly that they want from us. If you're not too familiar with turn-based strategy, here's the gist of it. You're set up in an isometric perspective where you and your opponent take turns in maneuvering your units around the map and engaging the enemy troops. You have a limited number of actions you can perform on your turn before surrendering control back to the opponent in sort of a stop action type deal as opposed to real-time strategy games. The emphasis is on carefully planning out every movement for the highest chance of success. What sets XCOM apart though is how it adds a complex resource management system on top of all this. Not only are you in command of the troops on the ground, you're also charged with running pretty much every one of XCOM's dealings. As humanity's last-ditch effort, you're on a very tight budget, and how you balance the scarce resources available to you is every bit as challenging as the fighting. First, and most daunting of all, you start out with very limited means of monitoring for distress calls. This is important because if you fail to help a certain country or region enough times, they will withdraw their support for the XCOM program, leaving you with an even smaller income. Oftentimes you will be asked to choose between a few simultaneous missions, which makes you have to juggle between who to help and who to ignore, knowing you incur a higher risk of them leaving the program as a result. I think this is what most people point to when they talk about how much of a challenge this game is. Still, that's not all there is for you to manage. You have to funnel what little money you get towards keeping XCOM in the best shape possible. That doesn't only translate into what gear and weapons your crew gets, but also what facilities to build next or how well equipped your aerial response is. You also choose what new technologies to develop next, but even then you have to manage how best to spend the research team's time. This management cycle also bleeds into how you behave in combat. Recovering gear left behind by the enemy or even capturing enemy units alive unlocks new research abilities as well as some free equipment. But stunning enemies instead of killing them is a lot trickier, and for there to be any leftovers to loot, you cannot use some of the more destructive weapons you have at your disposal. Not only is this challenging in and of itself, it also maintains the tone of being clearly overmatched by a much more advanced opponent. I love how in the first few hours you feel so hopelessly underprepared for the task at hand that you can't ever imagine a time where resources will actually be abundant.
And they totally are by the end.
But where you'll spend most of the time is duking it out with the ETs out in the field. So, how is the combat? It's pretty great. And for me, it boils down to a couple key factors: variety and progression. Variety not so much in terms of maps, more on that later, but in terms of both your and the enemy's setups. There's a fair amount of liberty and personal preference when it comes to assembling your squad. You get a handful of different classes which you can mix and match to your liking. Plus, each class can be leveled up in a couple different ways, turning them into totally different assets once the fighting starts. All of this I found meshes very organically with your own particular playstyle. Also, since deaths and injuries can carry over from mission to mission, the game will more often than not throw a monkey wrench in your favorite starting squad, pushing you to adapt to a new strategy or take on less experienced units, which tests your versatility. The same goes for the enemy. The enemy units themselves vary to a degree where you must approach different foes in very different ways, which a lot of times translates into a fair amount of patience and planning from you, lest you risk some hefty damage to your forces. This shuffling of your and your adversary's setups keeps the action fresh all throughout the endgame, I felt. And number 2, progression. And what I mean by this is how the game starts you off feeling so ill-equipped and short on supplies to deal with a clearly superior enemy. Researching new technology and scavenging some dropped items is such a painstaking process that it feels like every single new item you get has some level of impact. Oh, you've researched a new rifle? Great, you have enough cash to build, one? Time to equip that one new rifle on one of your 5 team members. And this goes on for every level of tech and upgrade you get. This and the overall resource management aspect I mentioned before were truly the game's calling cards for me. However, there were a couple of things I found to be not so good. I did run into a lot of graphical glitches, mostly to do with the field and depth of view. There were also a lot of times where the range and cover systems felt completely counterintuitive, like getting perfect point-blank position on an enemy with no cover yielding very low chances of success, and so on. And like I mentioned before, there's also the matter of map diversity being an issue by the end of the game. For me, this was offset somewhat by how much I kept enjoying the combat regardless, but still, you do notice it. Then there's another layer, which is how people who played the original were frustrated by a couple more things, or rather noticed some flaws I did not when comparing how the original still did some things better than this one, which is totally valid. Me, I could not make that comparison as I did not play the original like the pleb that I am. Having said all that, should you move XCOM Enemy Unknown up or down on your backlog? This is a pretty easy recommendation for me, especially if you're a fan of turn-based strategy games. By all means move it up. Shit is tight! On the other hand, if you want to wait for a sale so you can bundle it with the Enemy Within expansion, I fully support that decision also. Wait, that reminds me. Right, yeah, I do not have the expansion pack yet, so I did not play it for this review. Though that presents a very real possibility of me replaying this game once I do pick it up. In closing, I'd like to mention how a lot of well thought out details pile on top of some very solid gameplay, like how you're supposed to get attached to your squad members. Giving them some unusual nationalities helps both with novelty and feeling like this Earth defense business is truly a global effort. Also, how the campy sci-fi feel pays homage to the original while remaining surprisingly sober and self-aware. Derivative, yes, but very well executed. It knows just how serious to take itself. Hell, I didn't even expect a satisfying conclusion to the plot, and it still gave me one. Also, while doing research for this video, I've found that a lot of big-time reviewers described this as a harsh, cruel game. One, I think, called it the hardest game of its generation or some such nonsense. The game is challenging, to a point where you begrudge it at the very start. And it is a good challenge, one I thoroughly enjoyed. But some people completely oversell how hard it is. Don't let that in any way detract you from trying it out. Right, that's it for me guys. Thanks for sticking it out for yet another video. If you can give the video a like and share it around, that'd be sweet. And leave us a comment too, don't be shy. Take care everybody, more videos incoming, see you all soon.